Hello, and welcome to The Greater Loop, a podcast of the World Affairs Council of Greater Houston. My name is Maryanne Maldonado. Today I'll be your host, and we're talking about the U.S.-Israel war. It's been going on for nearly 6 months, and there's still no clear path out. Iran is under enormous pressure. The Strait of Hormuz is threatening the global economy. Washington and Jerusalem may not agree on everything. Is the U.S. actually winning? Or are we heading toward a bigger war? Today, we're joined by defense strategist Michael O'Hanlon, a senior fellow at Brookings and one of the country's leading experts on U.S. defense strategy and national security, to cut through the headlines and help us answer the question everyone is asking: how does this end? Michael, welcome.
Thank you, Maryanne. Nice to be with you.
Well, great to have you. And now we're here 6 months into this war. President Trump has suggested this conflict would be relatively quick 6 months ago. Why has this turned into such a prolonged stalemate, in your opinion?
Well, let me start at sort of the philosophical level. If you don't mind, I'll be brief. But that is that when world leaders through history promise short wars, they're usually wrong. And war has a way of surprising people. It has a way of making the other side angry and therefore more determined to fight. Whether that other side is in the right or in the wrong is sort of separate from the question of what happens to human beings when under duress and involved in violence. We're a fairly violent species, if you want to be blunt about that, at a biological and philosophical level. And also, leaders as a group historically tend to be ambitious and sometimes a little overconfident. And therefore, that reinforces the tendency towards thinking war will be quick. And often a country that has a big economy, good technology, a strong military, a leader of that kind of a country, like the United States today, is even more prone to overconfidence because he or she knows all the great gadgets we've got, the great people we have operating the gadgets. And President Trump in particular was also probably boosted in his morale by the remarkable raid that snatched President Maduro in Venezuela on January 3rd of this year, just a few weeks before the Iran war began. And that gets to the specifics of this case, where Trump, I think, was sort of riding a crest of optimism, and he was starting to realize just how good this American military that he was in charge of had become over the years. I think it's been very good for a long time, and don't buy into the allegations that it somehow got too woke or too diverse or too politically correct or too focused on peacekeeping missions or any of the other allegations that are often directed at the U.S. Armed Forces. They are fantastic, and President Trump figured it out. But he therefore assumed that you could give them any mission under the sun and they'd be equally successful. And that's, of course, not true. We saw that in Iraq. We saw that in Afghanistan. We saw it in Vietnam. Just because the military is spectacular, especially like those cases of Iraq and Afghanistan, it doesn't mean they can do the impossible. It doesn't mean that they can easily handle a complex mission that involves multiple levels of politics and psychology, not just attacking and destroying targets. And when you factor in the idea that you're dealing with an Iranian regime that for 47 years has been nursing an ideology of violence against the West, even against its own people, as we saw in January this year, when maybe 30,000 Iranians were slaughtered in the streets by their own government. When you try to impose your will on that kind of a group, you get into trouble. And again, one last point I'll make that completes this first answer is that not just the snatching of President Maduro by U.S. Special Forces in January, but Prime Minister Netanyahu's earlier success with the Israeli military at killing leaders of Hamas and Hezbollah all contributed to this idea that we could use high technology and great intelligence powered by AI and the ability to take out some bad leadership and really transform a situation. But that's not usually the way it works. And what we're seeing is, you know what, the son of the Iranian president is pretty angry that we killed his father, or that Israel did, with our support. And therefore, this regime is now even more committed to the violent extremist ideology that they had before the conflict even began.
Is diplomacy at this point even a realistic option for us?
Well, sure. I mean, diplomacy is always worth trying, but I don't know when it's going to work. And, you know, I think having some people on both sides in air-conditioned hotels talk to each other even if it's unlikely to succeed, that's a small price to pay for a conflict that can otherwise hurt so many people or injure and kill so many people. So we should certainly be trying diplomacy. But I think we have to have a realistic expectation of how soon it can work and what other things may have to happen first for our prospects to be improved.
We all know the Strait of Hormuz has become the biggest kind of immediate flashpoint. It's open, it's closed, it's being controlled by us, it's being controlled by them. What exactly is Iran trying to achieve by redirecting traffic through the strait? Just to wear down our economy and make things more expensive and see if we'll last?
Yeah, I think that's it. I think that Iran, first of all, follows our political debates and our policy debates very carefully. They know that we have midterm elections coming up, that the midterm prospects for the Republican Party might be damaged by high inflation and gasoline prices, that President Trump is the person that attacked them and also killed their friend Soleimani back in his first term, Soleimani being the Iranian terrorist mastermind who had every reason to be killed. But nonetheless, from the Iranians' point of view, they want revenge against the person who authorized that. And they want revenge against the person who's been implicated in killing their own current leadership more recently. And so you add all this up, and I think the Iranians say, we can tolerate the pain better than the Americans, and we would like to make President Trump pay a price, not just for the sake of revenge politically, which is part of it, but also because we want to make sure Israel and the United States won't do this sort of thing again. We want to make sure they are aware of the pain and suffering that are associated with any war against Iran, because Iran probably can't really defeat us in a battlefield sense. But when you factor in the psychology, the economics, the politics, they may be able to outlast us in some ways, and therefore make us think twice or three times or four times before we attack like this ever again.
So what we hear is that the strait is open. Iran says it's closed. The shipping traffic we know is severely, severely blocked, or at least disrupted. What do you actually know who is controlling the strait right now, or the water?
Violence is controlling the strait. This is not a war either side is winning in any discernible way. Both sides are collectively using force, with the net result being that there's very little traffic through the Strait of Hormuz. And therefore, the global economy in oil, gas, helium, certain other things that are common in the Persian Gulf or derivative from hydrocarbons, all of these things are being adversely affected. So if you want, it's the bad guys that are winning, not so much in the sense of Iran winning, but the bad guys in the sense of inflation, higher prices, less food for the world, just a greater anxiety. And certainly the Gulf states on the other side, on the southern/western side of the Persian Gulf, our friends, United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, these countries are being hurt, and so is Iraq, just further up the Persian Gulf, because they're the ones that get hit by retaliation or are affected by violence in some other way.
What do you think is the alignment right now between the U.S. and Israel?
Strained. I think that clearly Prime Minister Netanyahu is a very astute student of American politics. He knew how to play President Trump. I think I'm not suggesting that Trump was duped into joining the war, but I think Netanyahu made the best possible case for why the United States should go along, and also why they should try to kill the Ayatollah on the opening day, and also why Israel should still be, going after every last Hamas fighter in Gaza. And this whole series of arguments, I think Netanyahu makes sincerely, but he also tries to persuade President Trump, and he has a great deal of success, generally speaking, in doing so, to the point where there may be a little bit of buyer's remorse in the White House these days. President Trump may have felt that he was too easily persuaded by the whole kit and caboodle of everything Netanyahu has wanted to do with his military in the last 3 years. I tend to think that Israel is an amazing country that had an obligation and every right to retaliate for October 7th, 2023, but that has gone too far in a number of ways since then. And that the United States, as a friend of Israel, should be willing to push back and not easily go along with every single Israeli idea. President Trump may be coming to that conclusion himself, but a little bit belatedly.
You think they're both vying for the same end game?
Well, yes, in the most abstract sense. Everybody wants a peaceful Middle East. Everybody wants Israel to be safe and secure. Everybody wants violence to end and other peoples in the Middle East to be safe and secure as well. So all those things, I think, are basically commonly understood. The one difference might be in the importance of a Palestinian state. Israel, I think, I like to believe that Israelis are humane enough to want good for the Palestinian people, but not every Israeli wants a country for the Palestinian people, and certainly Prime Minister Netanyahu does not. So on that end state, there is a difference. But in terms of generally trying to foster a more stable and peaceful and prosperous region, we completely agree. The question is how to get there. And here, Netanyahu has decided that maybe even an extra dose of violence and an extra prolongation of some of the conflicts is better for Israel. It certainly seems to be better for his own political career because, he's sort of a wartime conciliary, to quote The Godfather. He's a wartime leader. The Israeli people may not like him in every way and may partly blame him for October 7th happening in the first place, but they also feel like he's responded with a resoluteness and, a intensity that they appreciate. And that may actually be one of the things that's still keeping him in office. They have elections coming up in 2 months. We'll see what happens there.
How much freedom do you think Netanyahu actually has to pursue another round of military action, regardless of what Washington wants?
Well, I think he has leeway, but he may not have a good argument. I don't know what he would achieve. I think that you're never going to destroy Hamas and Hezbollah as ideas. And at some point, you've got to say enough is enough. Let's rebuild and let's try to create structures that are viable and that can offer a better life for their own people as the best path towards lasting peace. And I would have said that day had arrived a couple of years ago for Gaza. And I don't know exactly when for Lebanon and Hezbollah, but, a while ago. But Netanyahu is a man of the sword, and he wants to keep up with what he's good at.
Iran appears to be betting that it can survive the pressure and outlast the U.S. politically. Is that actually Tehran's best strategy at this point?
There's two ways to answer that question. One is to imagine that the Iranian leadership is humane and interested in the well-being of its own people and of other people. And of course, that's not the case. If that were the case, then they should certainly stop and get the deal they can get right now, because they could get a good deal right now. They can get their economy back, their frozen assets. They can get trade sanctions lifted. They can get the Strait of Hormuz reopened. And all they would need to do is accept some limits on their nuclear weapons ambitions and some limits perhaps on their long-range missiles, and then not blatantly rearm Hamas or Hezbollah right in front of our eyes. They could probably figure out some surreptitious way to get a little bit of that done, which is important to them and probably impossible for us to completely prevent. So if the Iranian leadership had a decent set of values and an emphasis on the well-being of other people, including their own people, then they should want to negotiate right now, and they should and could get a pretty good deal right now. On the other hand, they are who they are. And I think we're increasingly learning, and people like my colleague here, Suzanne Maloney, who's an expert on Iran, could have told you this 6 months ago before the war even started, that the people in line of succession below the top level leadership are not any more moderate, not any nicer, not any less committed ideologically. And in fact, Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the Ayatollah, seems in some ways to be even harder line than his father. And he certainly is even angrier than his father because his father has been killed before his eyes, and I think other members of his family as well. And so this Mojtaba Khamenei, who, by the way, also trained as a young man with the most extreme elements of the Iranian intelligence and security forces, and people like him, they're not going to be any more reasonable by our standards of judgment, by our principles, and they're unlikely to want to do a deal anytime soon. I think they want to see if, as Western oil reserves really run low, they can really jack up the prices even more and punish Trump, but as I say, politically this November, but also just see what kind of damage they can do to the world economy, make us all feel it, and for the United States, of course, and you're sitting there in Houston, one of the oil capitals of North America, if not the oil capital. And so there are parts of North America that can benefit from higher oil prices. But of course, the country as a whole, the consumer population as a whole, doesn't want that. I don't even think most people in Houston want that. And so, in that regard, I think the Iranians are going to see how much pain they can inflict on us and see how we react.
How much can China and Russia realistically do to keep Iran afloat economically and with the military efforts?
Well, it's interesting. The role of these countries is complicated, although Russia's may be simpler. Russia is a great beneficiary of the Iran war because the driving up of oil prices is making it easier for them to stay afloat economically, even as we've put so much pressure on their oil and gas exports and their economy in general. So it's sort of throwing a lifeline to Putin, and that's really regrettable, of course. China may not, really be trying to help us, but they are helping us indirectly because they have built up their oil and gas reserves over the years. They have maintained enough coal burning power plants. They can revert back to coal where they need to. And they've got a lot of electrification of their economy, their car fleet, et cetera. And so part of the reason why oil prices have not gone even higher, despite 10 million barrels out of 100 million barrels a day of world consumption being compromised by the shutdown of the Strait of Hormuz. So we've taken off the market almost 10% of world oil, and yet we're only seeing prices up by, 10%, 20%. And usually you would expect much worse. But the reason is partly because China's demand has been suppressed. And I think Iran is very interested in exploring whether countries like China still have enough reserves and enough options that they can survive another 6 months of this war, perhaps, without gas prices doubling. And, so China's helped us because a lot of economists back in the winter thought that oil prices would go up much higher, gasoline prices much higher if this war continued into the summer. And so far they haven't. And that's largely because of the way China's protected itself. But that's also had the indirect secondary effect of helping us and everyone else around the world.
Now, the UAE has suspended trade and ties with Iran, given their renewed missile attacks. Does Iran risk losing the broader regional support and economic connections that it needs to sustain this conflict?
Well, Iran is always going to be a complicated problem for the Gulf states because they don't want to be at war with it because Iran can shoot at them practically within eyesight. But on the other hand, they don't like Iran. They don't trust the regime, and they fear the regime. So I think you're always going to have a complex calculus from these countries. It's not like they are trying to prop up the Iranian regime, but they would rather avoid all-out confrontation. And the worst thing for them is to make Iran just angry enough to fire back all these missiles, but not to defeat Iran. And that's, of course, sort of the world that we're in right now. So it's not like the UAE declared war on Iran. They're not sending across warships or troops to embark on Iranian soil. They simply, as you say, suspended normal relations. That's as much as anything a symbolic step because they're going to be very careful. They're going to tiptoe into any kind of stronger reaction, knowing full well that Iran has a lot of ways to hurt them.
And Michael, this has been so informative. Thank you so much. Last question. What does winning actually mean for each side at this point?
I'm glad you asked because with great respect, I'm going to reject the question, although I will answer it, but also reject it. What I mean by that is winning should not be our concern. Coming out in some place where we can brag that we got more of what we wanted than Iran got of what it wanted is not the right way to think about how to end a war. It's often the way that leaders think, which is why they keep fighting, because they want to win. But we just need two things. Well, maybe three. We need the Strait to reopen, we need the violence to stop, and we need Iran's nuclear ambitions to always be curtailed going forward. And if we have to take a loss of prestige along the way, if the world thinks that Iran, sort of outfought us because they were playing to mix my metaphors, they were playing a weak hand, but playing it well. And they prolonged this a lot longer than people thought. And they, took sort of an ounce of our flesh out of us along the way. And they embarrassed President Trump. And therefore they won. Who cares? I mean, sure, they can have that bragging session if they want to. I won't be listening. I won't be very interested in what they say or claim about victory. I will just know that for the safety of my family and my country, we wound up in a place where Iran's not pursuing the bomb and the Strait of Hormuz is reopened, oil prices and gas prices and so forth go back down, and the violence stops. Those three things happen. History books can debate who won, but we will have achieved the best we can achieve from this moment going forward because we are where we are and we can't walk back the last 6 months. So we got to keep our eye on the prize, which is peace, prosperity, and no nuclear weapons. In that sense, President Trump, even though I don't really admire the way he's fought this war, he's a pretty good communicator because I think he would have said something pretty similar to what I just did.
It's been our honor and pleasure to have you. Thank you so much for joining us today. Check out his new book, To Dare Mighty Things, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Maryanne. Best wishes.